Thank you for joining us for a recorded web briefing from the National Archives and Records Administration. In this recorded web briefing from April 22nd, 2014, Kevin DeVorsey will review the new transfer guidance for sending permanent electronic records to the National Archives. Let's join the briefing.
Kevin DeVorsey is a supervisory electronic records format specialist in the Policy Analysis and Environment Division of Agency Services at the National Archives and Records Administration. He's located in New York City. He directs the team responsible for developing guidance that defines the electronic formats that are appropriate for use by federal agencies, transferring their permanent records to NARA. And with all of that said, I'd like to pass it off to Kevin, who's going to get us started today.
Hi, thank you, Paulette. As she said, I am Kevin DeVorsey, and I've been in this position at the National Archives since 2010. And prior to that, I had worked in another part of NARA in the archival side, dealing with electronic records. But I came into this position and was given the task of updating and revising NARA's transfer guidance. And I thought I'd give a little bit of a overview of the transfer guidance that all of you will have been working with for the last 10 years as kind of an explanation of how we came to the conclusion of how to revise it and move forward, resulting in what has been released in February as our new transfer guidance. As I said, I was hired in 2010, and I came in and was told, we need to revise our transfer guidance. I thought, oh, this will be a very straightforward project. We'll just look and see what formats are out there and make our selections and publish this guidance. But clearly, electronic records are very complicated, and federal records, things aren't very cut and dry. So part of the challenge for me was understanding how agencies create and use records, and then also learn NARA's processing environment and how we deal with electronic records coming through our door once they're transferred to us. So I'll give a little overview of what I'm going to discuss. So when I was hired, I was kind of given some overarching goals for the transfer guidance. And, at the time I was pretty new. I hadn't been working at NARA on the transfer of records. I didn't have a lot of experience with what existing problems there were. So I kind of came in and had to learn the environment that we were working in, and through conversations with people in federal agencies and then across NARA, I kind of learned what were some of the issues that we were having with the transfer guidance that were the cause for it to be revised. Then I'm going to jump over to the changes that we've enacted, and a lot has changed in electronic records since the previous guidance was put up between 2002 and 2004, and so we've created new categories of records, and I'll go into those. And then I'll map, here's the old guidance, and here's the new, and here's how they relate to one another. NARA is dynamic, and we're trying to adapt to changes in the federal records management environment, and so recently we've come out with the capstone email guidance that you may have heard of, which puts forward a different way that agencies can praise and schedule email records. And so fortunately, we were doing our transfer guidance simultaneously, and so we were able to look at what they were doing and account for it. And so I'll explain that relationship between the transfer guidance and capstone. And then I'm just going to dive into a couple of the new categories that we've defined, including structured data and presentations, and just kind of give an explanation for those. And then I'll open up for questions, but of course, feel free to jump in with questions at any time, and I'll do my best. Because I recognize that the transfer processes in electronic records are inherently complicated, and so it's difficult to give, this is the situation that applies to every agency. There's just too much variation across the federal workplace for things to be straightforward all the time. So as I said, I was hired in 2010, and I was given these kind of overarching goals for what the revised guidance should look like. And one of the main problems that was put forward was that the existing guidance wasn't flexible enough. It was put into place between 2002 and 2004 as a part of a previous presidential e-government initiative. And it wasn't NARA sitting down and saying, these are the formats that we would like to bring in. It was a cross-governmental project. And so NARA was the project lead, but agencies self-identified what categories of records they would like to address and then helped pick those formats. The result was 6 products that kind of stand alone and were released as soon as they were done. But that process took 2 years, between 2002 and 2004. So they released a product for email, for web records, for geospatial records, for digital photographs, for scanned text, and for PDF records, one at a time. And by the time they finished that project, they realized, this is very cumbersome, spending 6 months, working on each of these to try and account for every change in formats. It just wasn't nimble enough to keep up with how quickly technology was changing. So that was one of the challenges put before us, is how can you rethink this and come up with a way that won't be as cumbersome and won't take as long. Another issue was, we're the National Archives, and we have the responsibility to preserve and provide access to records, whether they're paper or analog or electronic, for as long as they are needed. And so with permanent records, that can be a very long time. And so clearly it's in our best interest if agencies use formats that are ubiquitous, that are open, which means we can go to the internet and find the technical specifications. If it's a proprietary format where we can't find any information about it, then that can pose problems to us. But then we recognize that across the government, not everybody's going to use those formats, and the commonly accepted. So I was just giving the kind of overview of the environment that we walked into in being charged with revising it, and it was important to understand how was what has been up for the last 12 years, how was it put together, what was the thought process that went into it, what were its goals, and then what were some of the issues that they ran into that it's taken 12 years for us to come back and try and address. And so, one of the problems that I mentioned was that it was done as a presidential e-government initiative, and so it wasn't NARA sitting down and saying, okay, here's the types of things we're interested in. It was a very well-meaning project, but we were collaborating with other agencies, and so there was this formal structure that was worked through. And so they came out with these separate products, basically describing different categories of electronic records. And at the time, they came up with 6. There was one for geospatial records, one for email, web records, scanned text, PDF, and did I say email? There's one, digital photographs. Okay, we'll accept that there are 6. And, when they sat down with agencies and looked at them, clearly they were looking to the long term and looking at our environment at NARA that they had to process electronic records. Think back to 2002, we didn't have these huge server farms that we could park records on. The methodology was to copy records coming in onto magnetic tapes and park those on a shelf and update those every 5 years. So the formats that they selected were necessarily a very constrained group of formats focused on open standards. Now, the adoption of electronic records and the identification by agencies of what is the record has swung in the last 10 or 12 years much more towards electronic forms. An agency, for a committee meeting, in the past, they would present the paper copy of the transcript of that meeting as the record copy. Today, the videotape of that meeting is now being presented as the record copy. So there was clearly a need to rethink some of the formats that we had identified and the categories that we had identified in the past. And so that's that balance of we aim for perfection, but we can't expect all federal agencies to use exactly the formats that NARA does, because that's just unrealistic. You have your own business needs that you need to comply with. One goal, and this was a lesson learned, was, if we put up this very narrow band of formats, then it's going to be common that agencies are using something other than those. And so there's this kind of unspoken idea that, well, you'll convert into one of the formats that we accept. And, that's a risky proposition. It's very easy to lose information or alter a record when you do that. So if at all possible, we hope to be able to broaden the formats that we accept and minimize that necessity. One of the other problems was, we put up transfer guidance and we identified formats, but people were referring to it, and rightfully so, at other points in the record's life cycle. If you're standing up a system, clearly you want to make sure that NARA is going to accept the records when they're ready to come to NARA. But the problem is that might be 20 years from now, might be 25 years from now. And so having this one set of guidance, it was very difficult for it to describe the formats that we will take today, the formats that we'll take 20 years from now if you're standing up a system, or some agencies have very long-term retention periods of up to 100 years. So having a single set of format-related guidance, it just isn't possible for it to answer all of the life cycle questions. And so our goal was to try and narrow the transfer guidance down, and I've got this electronic records life cycle up there. We were hoping, if we can really focus the transfer guidance on that period of transfer, and my team's currently working on additional guidance around records creation, so if you're doing scanning projects, things like that. And then we're, in the future, in the not very distant future, going to work on long-term maintenance guidance. So if you have a 100-year retention period, we'll be able to tell you what to do. And it's, don't look at the transfer guidance and keep things in this format for the next 100 years. It's more, here are the things you're going to need to do to make sure you can maintain these records in a preservable way. And then when you do transfer them, they will be in a form that NARA will accept. So one of the complexities was, we've had this transfer guidance up for the past 12 years, and we've been telling people, here are the formats that we accept. But the world had changed. So it's not as simple as going and saying, okay, we've been telling you use these formats for the past 12 years, now stop. That wouldn't be fair. We didn't want to pull the rug out from under you. But the reality is that certain things have changed, and so some of the formats that we encouraged agencies to use in the past, we would no longer want to encourage people to adopt them, but we wanted to make it flexible and encourage people to transfer things in and make it clear, what are we pushing people to adopt and what are things we'd like them to move away from. So to accomplish that, we came up with categories. And so we have 3 categories. One was preferred formats, and that's closer to the preservation formats. These were things that when we look at them, they tended to be international standards, fully documented, very ubiquitous in the marketplace, lots of tools that support them. And then there are ones that may not rise to that level. They may be ubiquitous. There may be a published standard, but it hasn't gone through the vetting process. And then there was the category acceptable for imminent transfer, and that was to allow us to retire formats if they fell out of favor. And I'll give a couple examples of those. In the original transfer guidance, we identified for geospatial records a format, SDTS, Spatial Data Transfer Standard. And that it was developed by the U.S. Geological Survey. But if you go to their website, you'll see that the website's maintained for historical reasons, and it's not a format that's being actively developed. And so, for the past 12 years, we've been saying, here's a format you should adopt. But the times have changed, so we don't want to push you to adopt that format. But if you have records and you've been banking on us taking them, we don't want you, to be upset. it just means get in touch with us, and we'll work with you to figure out the best way to bring those records in as quickly as practical. And then, the biggest challenge was we wanted to be a little more agile. It took so long to put into place each of these categories of records in the past that is there a way we could structure the guidance so that it wouldn't take as long? And we worked with our general counsel's office and with other people, and we came up with a way which we believe is going to work. We're going to test it very soon. But we split the guidance into two pieces. And there is a bulletin, which is kind of a traditional bulletin. It gives the authority and the scope of the project. And we used it to describe general requirements that apply to all electronic records. And then we also have kind of the instructions that you can follow and lots of contact information depending on the type of electronic record. If you have additional information that you require from NARA, get in touch with these people. I mentioned there are some general requirements, and one thing, it makes perfect sense if you think about it, but being electronic records, the language can be a little complicated and possibly confusing. So I'll go ahead and mention it now because I got an email earlier today about this. As the National Archives, we bring in records from across the government. And so a fundamental thing, regardless of the record type, if there's a password that is required to access that record, we ask agencies to deactivate that, because if it comes in and we don't have the password, then we're unable to meet our responsibilities in vetting these records and processing them and ultimately providing access. So if you think about a PDF record or a Word document, if there's a password to it, then we're locked out the way anybody else would be locked out. So we ask, please deactivate that type of encryption. Well, the complexity comes, a lot of agencies require that the hard drives that they use to transfer records be encrypted. So, we acknowledge that, and so we wanted to be clear that follow agency policies in regards to encryption of media, but just when it comes down to those individual files that you're turning over to the National Archives, that's the type of encryption that we want deactivated. So we've done our best in the bulletin to make those kind of general things very clear, but then we also have lots of contact information in case there are additional questions. So the major changes, one thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about is the categories. And so we tried to come up with new categories. Hopefully, we have a lot of different audiences for this guidance, but the primary one is agency records officers. They work closely with their IT people, but we didn't want it to just be IT guidance that goes over everybody's heads in terms of the terminology that we use. And so we tried to break it down into categories that make sense to pretty much anyone. So hopefully if you're a records officer and you look at our guidance, you'll find a home for the records that you have. You'll be able to see, if you have digital video files, you can go there and see what formats are acceptable there. I mentioned the previous guidance, and there was a product just for PDF. And so looking at it, PDF is a format, but we don't really see it as a category of records. PDF is now acceptable in a number of different categories of records, including scan text and presentations and geospatial. You can give us GeoPDFs, but there's no one place to look for PDF because we're looking more at big categories of things. I mentioned that we're trying to focus on transfer. So we tried to simplify the quality requirements because it's just not useful for you to, you're ready to transfer your records. They were created 15 years ago, and you're ready to transfer them, and we tell you, oh, you scanned them wrong, go back and start over. That's not really a useful discussion. And so we're going to work on the records creation part of it as a different set of guidance, but trying to strip it down to what are the minimum things that must be met for NARA to be able to bring these records in the door. One thing that makes most people happy, there were the technical questionnaires that when you were scheduling records, you had to fill out describing the electronic records. those were tied very, very closely to the previous transfer guidance, and so it simply didn't make sense to continue those, and so they are no longer required. We've worked on a replacement, and it's a form. It's 8 questions, and they're very high-level questions, not as difficult to answer, and it's only required if the transfer is immediate or within 3 years. So the paperwork involved is much less than it used to be. And one thing is, if you come to our guidance and you look and you know that you have electronic records that are permanent and you don't see the format mentioned, contact us. And so the custodial unit can work with you and figure out what the best next step is. And that was, we don't want you to have to migrate to a new format. That may be the right way forward, but get in touch with us so we can help guide you in the next step there. As I said, my team is actively looking at this. This is our job, and so we want to expand this guidance. We looked at, I have a screen. The original guidance had something like 14 formats, and now we're up to 55. But we're looking to add to that. I think we're going to add calendar formats very soon. So it is viewed as a dynamic thing. It's not static, and we're not going to sit on it for 12 years. We look to do our best to keep it up to date. So I mentioned that we had come up with these categories to hopefully provide a home for records that you wouldn't look at it and scratch your head and think, I don't see a place where my stuff makes sense. So we have a broad category of digital still images, and that includes digital photos, scanned text, and digital posters. And that was, we tried to look at what is the type of information that is contained here, and then what are the formats that are used. So if there were commonalities, we tried to lump things together. And then digital moving images includes digital cinema and digital video. In digital cinema, the format's a little different than digital video. It's not terribly common right now, but we do have some larger agencies that are scanning 35 millimeter films and then also doing kind of the higher level digital cinema. So the custodial unit felt like it made sense to include a special category for that. We also have digital audio, which along with digital moving images is a new category. And then text. The original transfer guidance didn't call this out directly. It was included there, but it was almost the very earliest transfer guidance, which said that NARA accepted ASCII and EBCDIC, which are kind of holdovers from the old mainframe data days. We still have geospatial records, but we've added a new category for computer-aided design. And so that's the kind of 3D files and architectural stuff that we're seeing more and more of. I mentioned that we didn't really have a category for text before. Similarly, we didn't have a category for structured data, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But so we've added this to more directly address, if you have a database, here is what NARA would like you to do with that data in terms of transferring it. Obviously, email and web records, those were in the original guidance, but we've updated them to kind of match what's going on today. And I mentioned capstone. I hope this is visible, but it was just trying to give a sense of the relationship between the old and the new. And you can see the old 6 categories: email, digital photographs, scanned text, PDF, geospatial, and web. And now we have these new categories are the ones in pink, where it's, we have textual data, which is a place for word processed files, not just mainframe data. Computer-aided design, presentation formats, digital audio, structured data, digital moving images, these are all new categories. They're trying to broaden what we will accept, really hoping to make things easier for agencies that want to transfer electronic records to us. That's the goal. And you can see that from 14 formats, we now have 55. We've really hopefully broadened so that we don't have to have those conversations about fundamental things like Microsoft Word documents, we can focus our attention on some of the trickier things that you're probably dealing with. So I mentioned these are the new categories, and I think it reflects what we're starting to see more and more. I know I've been contacted a lot about architectural CAD formats. Obviously, word processing files are very, very common, and we're seeing a lot more video and audio. Structured data has been that's been kind of the bread and butter of NARA, bringing in these huge data sets in the past. But then presentations, such as the one I'm showing right now, we see that a lot, and so we wanted to be able to address it. So now, I mentioned that NARA has also released this new capstone email guidance, and I won't go into too much detail about it since it kind of focuses on a different method of appraisal where agencies, it's an optional thing, but if your agency chooses to adopt it or a part of it, you can go through and identify senior officials and say that individual's email is all permanent. And so rather than the kind of old method of print and file or select an individual email and put it in a records management application, we would allow you to say, give us their entire mailbox with all the subfolders. Since we were doing that, it made sense to update the transfer guidance to support that kind of appraisal. And so now we include, we're calling aggregation formats. So if you're using something like Microsoft Exchange or Microsoft Outlook, you can output that user's PST file with all of their subfolders, and that's acceptable for transfer. And Mbox is another format that allows you to do that, and Gmail will allow you to output email as Mbox. But then, we still recognize that not everybody's going to do capstone since it is optional, and so we have support, and we've updated it, so there are additional formats for email messages if you want to transfer individual messages. One thing at the bottom there I mentioned, the old transfer guidance actually said, do not give us email as things like RTF files or PDF files. So it was a little bit of a conflict because on one hand we were saying print and file, and PDF is kind of a print thing, but then we were saying don't give us PDF. We recognize that in some cases there are systems such as Lotus Notes where PDF may be the least bad option. Lotus Notes is kind of notorious for not having a lot of export options, and it's a very proprietary system, so we don't want to bring in Lotus Notes systems to the National Archives. So we've constructed it in a way that, if you get in touch with a processing archivist, they can work with you to figure out, of all these options that we're providing, which is the best one in your situation. So we really did spend a lot of time talking to agencies and then also to the staff at NARA to hopefully have a sense of what's going on and make sure that the guidance that we were putting out reflects reality. We didn't want to put out something that's impossible to comply with. I mentioned structured data. Interestingly, we have a long history. The first electronic records coming into the National Archives in the late 60s, early 70s from NASA and the Department of Defense is all structured data, but it was pretty simple. And so our transfer guidance at the time was 1-inch magnetic tape with ASCII records or EBCDIC records, these two character sets. Obviously, the world has changed a lot, and so it seemed to make sense to address structured data in databases. And as with Lotus Notes, this is a complicated area, and we simply don't have the ability to manage 15 different types of databases, Oracle, Sybase, Informix, Microsoft SQL Server, all of these things. And so we still ask agencies to output the permanent records from those systems in a format that we can handle. And we've updated that from EBCDIC and ASCII to include other types of formats such as JSON or XML or even CSV files. And we looked long and hard at the model being put forward by data.gov, and hopefully, I think we're consistent with that model. So if your agency is looking at it, hopefully if you're able to output records for data.gov, you'll be able to output them for NARA as well. And, we try not to be prescriptive saying, if you're doing this, you must do this, because the world is just too complicated for that. We really did try and present in each category of records a number of different options, and so we can work with you to identify what's the best option in this situation. So that's kind of an overarching goal, is to provide lots and lots of options. Presentations is a new category, and so obviously PowerPoints and things like that are very, very common. And so we saw fit to include a category for that and a number of different formats that are acceptable, including Microsoft PowerPoint, but then PDFA is a good option as well. And, one of the challenges to the transfer guidance is any format can be used in lots and lots of different ways. And so we try and make it clear that for presentations, they should be formal presentations. You could take all of the photographs from your camera and just upload them into a PowerPoint and turn them over. But in the world of records, we would look at those as digital photographs, not as a presentation. So we do try and steer the categories back to the way that a schedule would be written. And so just because you can put a certain type of information in a format doesn't mean that you should, or that NARA is encouraging you to do that. So, we try and keep that clear, because sometimes it gets a little bit fuzzy, since it is possible to do all these things. So here's my contact information, and I would open it up for questions. I know I covered a lot of material.
We hope that you found this briefing to be useful and informative. For more information about this topic, please visit us online at www.archives.gov, keyword transfer guidance.